This conference will now be recorded.
It is now 2:05 p.m. I would like to call the special joint meeting of the Cultural Heritage Commission, the Design Review Board, and the Public Arts Commission of May 14th, 2020 to order. Before I proceed, I want to take a moment to go over our meeting protocols for today. As you may have noticed, we are having a virtual special joint meeting. This meeting will be conducted in compliance with N2920 Executive Order to ensure the health and safety of the public by limiting human contact that could spread the COVID-19 virus. The council chambers is closed. Cultural Heritage Commissioners, Design Review Board members, Public Art Commissioners, and staff are all participating remotely. This meeting may be viewed online and through the city's local cable channels and website. In an effort to best facilitate dialogue and discussion during today's special joint meeting, I'm going to ask that the commissioners and board members are to be mindful of muting their microphones when not speaking. I will call on each member to speak one by one. If you want to speak at a different time, please feel free to raise your hand and you will be then called on. As a reminder, this meeting will need to conclude by 3 p.m. as a special Design Review Board meeting is scheduled at that time. I thank you all for your patience in advance as we proceed with our meeting today. Staff, if we could have roll call, starting with the Cultural Heritage Commission, please.
Vice Chair Hill.
Here.
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Chris Morris.
Here.
Commissioner Freeman.
Here.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I mixed the DRB with the CHC. Sorry, Vice Chair Thompson. Vice Chair Thompson. Chair Gallatin.
Here.
Commissioner Cross is absent today. So we'll do roll call for Design Review Board. Chair Smeaton.
Here.
Vice Chair Hill.
Here.
Commissioner Sy.
Here.
Board Member Yonker.
Hi, here.
Board Member Yeh. Here. Okay, Margaret, can you take the roll call for Public Art Commission?
Hey, Chair Wong.
Here.
Vice Chair Fong. Here. Commissioner Kuramitu. Here. Commissioner Burke.
Here.
Commissioner Sawyer.
Here.
Thank you, staff. At this time, we'll have a budget presentation from the Finance Director, which is our only item on our agenda today. And before we have the presentation, I just want to say on behalf and welcome on behalf of our three commissions and boards to our city manager, Stephanie DeWolf, and our finance director, Karen Aceves. We really appreciate this opportunity to hear about the budget and appreciate this show of transparency and communication on behalf of the city. So at this point, Karen, if we could please have your presentation.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, commissioners. Thanks for hosting us today as part of the budget outreach, as you mentioned, which is of particular importance this year. As many of you already know, we are facing some unprecedented financial challenges resulting from the coronavirus. So I'll have Kanika, can you put up the presentation? Just give it a moment.
Karen, the presentation is up. Yeah. I'll start the slideshow now.
Yes, thank you. And then you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. As I said, the coronavirus is a health pandemic and has had immediate and catastrophic effects. But it's also had immediate and catastrophic effects on many economies. Local governments have been hit particularly hard as we rely heavily on revenue sources which directly stem from economic activity. And as the social distancing protocols continue, those effects continue to compound. Many economists are suggesting that recovery will be slow even after those public gathering restrictions are lifted. Today, what I'd like to look at in terms of effect and recovery is how the city's top revenues might be affected and breaking that down into 3 time frames: short term through June 30th, 2020, which is the end of this fiscal year; midterm, which is through the end of June 30th, 2021, and long term, which is 3 years and beyond. Next slide, please, Kanika. The city's top 4 revenue sources include property tax, sales tax, the utility users tax, and user fees. Property tax is assessed at 1% of property values, and the city receives 24 cents on the dollar. Typically, property tax is slow to respond to economic downturns simply because of the way it's assessed, due, and paid. It takes about 1 year to catch up. As we look back at the Great Recession in 2008 and even further to the dot-com bubble in 2000, there's a pattern of about a 1 to 2% reduction in revenues in subsequent years, which would indicate that this revenue remains fairly stable. However, last week, Governor Newsom issued a late payment waiver on property taxes for commercial and residential buildings through May of next year. So this hasn't happened in any previous recession, no payment waivers like this, and we've yet to see how this will affect us. Next is sales tax at 13%. Last November, the city residents approved Measure A, increasing the sales tax by 3/4 cents to 10.25%, consistent with other cities. Of this, the city receives approximately a 1.75% share. And as we've seen, sales tax is rapid to respond to economic downturns. Simply in this quarter, some of our largest producers, including restaurants and gas stations, are down by 28%. And in addition to that, Governor Newsom also issued an executive order waiving any sales tax due to, from small businesses by a quarter. So that's about $300,000 in sales tax deferral and potentially $200,000 in revenue loss for this quarter. Next on the list is utility users tax at 11%. The city has a 7% UUT tax rate, which taxes utilities such as water, telecommunications, cable, and electricity. This entire amount, or $3.4 million, goes to the city and is largely unaffected by the pandemic, but is considered a diminishing revenue source. And what I mean by that is that every year we start to receive less and less dollars, simply because of things like water conservation. People are conserving more water and opting for non-traditional cable sources such as streaming sources, and that's not taxed. It's also important to know that the UUT is scheduled to sunset June 30th, 2022, if not renewed by voters, and that would be a $3.4 million loss to the city. Next on the list are user fees at 10%, and the city charges the cost of recovery or less in a lot of instances for city services. That amount is used to cover the cost of providing the service. As I said, some services are subsidized more than others, particularly community services is subsidized fairly high. And these can be rapid to respond to economic downturn, but depend greatly on behavioral pattern. Based on the stay-at-home order, really no community service programs are able to move forward right now, or facility rentals or large gatherings, and those are being affected heavily. However, planning and building permits seem to be slightly trending upward. Next slide, Kanika. So first, we'll look at the short-term revenue loss. Through June 30th, 2020, we see a potential for a 1.6 million loss since the beginning of this, since the end of March. Property taxes are coming in at about 100,000 less, or 1%, through natural decline. UUT has not seen has not been affected this year. However, as I mentioned before, it's a diminishing revenue source, so we will see a reduction next year. Next is sales tax, and as I mentioned, it's a combination of the deferral of sales tax payments and the potential of the 28% loss this quarter. And finally, user fees, which is a combination of everything from fines and forfeitures, facility rentals, community services classes, parking permits, everything goes under user fees. The city stands to lose approximately $1.2 million through the end of the year. Next slide, please. To match these short-term revenue losses, we looked at short-term revenue reductions. Obviously, the largest chunk here is capital costs at $1 million that we looked to reallocate from street projects to non-general fund sources, and other things like hiring freezes, travel and training freeze, contract reductions. Certainly, some are easier than others. The crossing guard contract was pretty easy to stop in that there are no crossing guard services being provided right now, and renegotiation of other contracts, furlough of non-working part-time employees, and operational budget freezes for a total of up to $1.7 million. So if you look at this list, it's little chunks everywhere, and obviously capital was the biggest place we could reduce, so we did that. But it's hard to pick and choose when you really need everything to balance the budget. Next slide, Kanika, please. We'll look at midterm next. And midterm through June 30th, 2021, we're looking at a potential for a $3.5 million revenue loss. Property taxes are 1 to 2% decline, as I mentioned earlier, just naturally after recessions, and then another 1 to 2% of potential non-payment. This doesn't include Governor Newsom's executive order, and we've still yet to see how that might affect us. UUT, as I said before, is a diminishing revenue source, and we see about 2 to 3% reduction every year in this revenue source. Sales tax is an assumption of 2-quarter losses. As we find out more and more that the stay-at-home order is extended and the recovery becomes more gradual rather than immediate, there's a very real potential for this 15% reduction. And finally, user fees. Simply in facility rentals alone, the city brings in upwards of $600,000, which if public gatherings are banned through the larger part of the fiscal year, we won't see any of that. Similar to parking enforcement, parking fees, any classes, filming, all that to total up to a 31% loss for the city. And I'll note that this is middle of the road. There is a potential that this could be larger than this, but we're really looking to aim at something that's, that uses 2 quarters as an assumption for loss. It may be better, although as we sit through the White House calls, the county calls, it looks like it will be gradual, and these numbers will be pretty on target. And next slide, Kanika. Again, to match those midterm revenue losses, we have to look at the midterm reductions, and we'll look at everything, including continuing those short-term reductions that I mentioned earlier, considering shifting additional capital dollars, the MOU reopeners, such as the elimination of cost of living adjustments, considerations of reductions in workforce. As you can see below, the majority of our organization is personnel, as we are a service organization at 70%. And operations comes in at 22%, and there's very little we can really cut from operations. You saw it's travel and training, it's little bits and pieces here and there. There's very little non-core items that we can cut. And then transfers out represents those capital projects that I mentioned earlier, for a total of $3.5 million through next year. Next slide, please. We're going to look at this all in terms of the budget outreach and the different departments. As you can see here, half of our city's general fund budget is allocated towards public safety, and the rest of it is split pretty consistently throughout the other departments. That, like I said earlier, there's very little we can cut from without really hindering the city's ability to move forward in its operations. Planning and building has to produce a general plan. Public Works has to inspect buildings and continue improvements on streets. Finance has to produce a budget and audit. So you can see, as we're looking through this, it's a very challenging process to come down to where and how we're going to cut that $3.5 million. Next slide, please. And we intend to do this all as part of the budget outreach. Currently, we have a budget outreach page dedicated to education and communication with over 800 views. And the goal really there is to have people understand what I'm presenting here, what our top revenue sources are, how that's affecting the city's finances, and create a dialogue between residents and the city. And that's part of what we're looking at with the survey results. We're hoping to engage a larger voice in the city and reach people that we've never reached before. As I'm probably sure you've all heard people say, these are unprecedented times. And so we're looking at different ways to reach people. We haven't been able to reach them through traditional ways such as town hall meetings. And typically we get 10 attendees there. And we think this is a big opportunity to really engage in that dialogue. And through this, we'll develop the budget. We will go to the Finance Commission next Tuesday, I believe, the 26th, and present the results of the survey and a draft budget to them. And finally to council on June 3rd. This will all culminate with the potential for the budget adoption on June 17th of this fiscal year. Next slide, Kanika. And I'll just add here that, you know, as much as this is a difficult time, there are cities who are much more affected, and those in tourism economies we've seen within the first week had to let go of upwards of 400 employees because 30 to 50% of their revenue relies heavily on sales tax and on tourism taxes or TOTs. And right here, what we see is the long-term implications also. If city residents don't renew the UUT, that's an additional $3.4 million loss. As I mentioned, we're not in the worst place. We're not in the best place, but we're not in the worst place. An additional $3.4 million would represent a significant, an even more significant loss in the monster under the bed. And it's also important to note that the city's pension liability might be faced with up to $2 million in additional costs because of the losses they've faced this year as well as a result of this pandemic. And this would all begin in 2022 at approximately $5.4 million. And obviously there are very many unknowns in this situation. It's not set in stone. Obviously, if city residents renew the UUT, that's not an issue. And if the state funnels money into PERS, that could be very helpful for the city. But obviously we have to plan for those things. And right now we have no indication of that happening. The closest thing we have is the HEROES Act legislation, which we'll see if it passes next year, but we don't stand to get nearly enough of what we need to close the budget gap. And with that, this concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much, Karen. It is now 2:23, so we have 37 minutes left in our meeting, and this is the time for questions or comments for staff. As I mentioned before, I'll call on each commissioner individually, and we're going to start with the Design Review Board and Member Tsai.
I have no questions at this time.
Thank you. Next, Board Member Lear.
I never thought about city losing money, you know. I just thought that, you know, the people are losing money. So that's, you know, a new thing that I learned today.
Yeah, it's definitely a codependency there. Absolutely. Everyone is losing. And cities in California are facing up to, in total, a $7 billion loss as a result of this.
Well,
I think we should add at this point as well, the governor just announced the status of the state budget this afternoon, and he announced there is a 22% loss in revenue to the state budget. So there will be significant cuts at the state and the county level as well as the local.
Commissioner, Board Member Lear, any additional comment or question?
no, that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Board Member Younger.
Hi, I have no questions or comments right now.
Thank you. Next,
Thank you.
Vice Chair Hill.
Just one question. Are we at risk for bankruptcy?
I wouldn't say we're at risk for bankruptcy now. We have emergency reserves and we have designated reserves, but I think depending on how this recovers in future years, we will have to make difficult decisions depending on where this goes. I wouldn't say bankruptcy now.
And let me chime in on that. I would not say bankruptcy ever, just to be clear. There are definitely some difficult situations on the horizon that may require significant restructuring of city services. It may change the services we deliver and the way we deliver them, but I don't anticipate it would ever involve bankruptcy. I mean, before we ever got to that point, the city would have the option of dissolving and becoming a part of the county. It doesn't require bankruptcy to go down that path. But we're not looking at any of those things. Quite honestly, what we're looking at in the long term is potentially significant restructuring. If we do not get a renewal of the UUT, as Karen pointed out, the city will lose $3.5 million on top of the $3.5 million that we have to cut because of the pandemic. That's $7 million out of a $26-27 million budget. If on top of that, we also get hit with higher PERS payments of $2 million per year, that's $9 million we'll have to cut out of a $26 million budget. So you can see if all of those things line up, the city can no longer function the way we are. With that, that's almost a 40% revenue cut. We would not be able to continue to function the way we are. And so we're looking at what that means down the line. 52% of our budget goes to public safety. And so even though that is something none of us want to consider and none of us want to touch, if we are faced with a 40% reduction in revenue, we will have no choice but to consider how we might restructure the single most expensive service that we provide. And there are a variety of different options of how we might do that. And so those are the kinds of things we'll look at if we lose the UUT.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Next, we'll hear from Chair Smeaton.
Hi, I do have a couple of questions. My first question is maybe a definition of furloughing non-working employees. What does that really mean, non-working?
So when this all began, non-working employees went home and were still paid. So non-working meaning that they are no longer able to provide the services just because of the circumstance we're in. Several library employees or community services employees that were no longer having after school programs or were no longer in the library the way we were before. So they are unable to continue their work at home. Certainly there are services that can...
Just to clarify, they are services that the city is no longer allowed to provide. So these are employees associated largely with recreation programs, senior programs, and library programs. So we are legally not allowed to provide those services right now, and those employees could not be transitioned to other responsibilities with the city. So they were at home without work, fully paid for 30 days. And at this point, we have furloughed those employees, so they will no longer be paid. But at such time that the economy recovers, or that the regulations are lifted and we're allowed to resume those activities, those employees would be rehired at that time.
Okay, I see. My second question deals with, and this could be Stephanie, probably Stephanie, it's probably a moot question, but we really can't afford to lose any city employees, that is a cutting. What can we cut? I certainly know with planning, we need everybody in there, I'm sure. So there's really not a lot of options on that end of it, is there?
Yeah, well, there's not, and I'm glad you raised that point. That a city like South Pasadena, we have a fairly small budget for a small city. I know people assume that South Pasadena it's an affluent community and we must have a large budget, and we really don't. We have a fairly conservative budget, and 70% of our costs go to personnel. And also to a point that Karen made, much of what we do is not discretionary. So those examples are, as you all know, in the planning department, by law, we have to have a zoning code, we have to have a planning commission, we have to have a housing element in a general plan, and we must, by law, accept and process applications, and we must process them within a specific amount of time. We've been given no relief from the Permit Streamlining Act. So we have to do those things. And there's similar requirements in every department. The finance department has to pay bills. They have to produce a balanced budget every year. They have to go through a number of different audits every year. So you're right, we can only cut our staff back to the level where we are still able to comply with state mandates for things that we have to do. So I would say there's a tiny little bit of room of things that we're doing now that are not state mandated. Unfortunately, the majority of those things are going to fall into recreation and library programs. Those are pretty much the only things we're doing that are not mandated. And that's why if down the line, the utility users tax is not renewed, correct, we cannot cut back enough staff to close that gap and still meet state mandates. So that's where it will require us to look at restructuring in order to provide the mandated services if we want to remain an independent city. That's right. There's very difficult challenges down the line if we lose the UUT.
Thank you.
All right, next we will turn to the Public Art Commission and hear from Commissioner Burke.
Hi there. I have two quick questions. First of all, I know that with consumer insurance that I believe it's the state is mandating some sort of a give back to consumers. Is there anything comparable to that coming down the line, either for CalPERS or for our liability pool, which I forget, I should know, is it JCPIA? I forget who we're with, but is there any possibility of getting reduction of payments from either of those two?
On the PERS issue, the CalPERS issue, no, there's nothing in the pipeline on that. In fact, when the governor announced his budget earlier today, he announced that a considerable amount of money that he was going to plug into PERS to help pay those dollars down, he's redirecting those funds to support education moving forward. So that means the investment balance of the PERS fund, which was going to be buoyed a little bit by an investment from the state, that's no longer going to happen. So, you know, the new PERS rates won't hit us for 2 years. A lot can happen in the next 2 years. But if things don't change, yeah, we will be hit with probably an additional $2 million a year starting in 2022, which unfortunately is the same point where we would lose the UUT revenue at the same time. That's where we get that catastrophic convergence of all of these things at the same time. As far as insurance, we're expecting a very small amount of money from our insurance providers. We're still working through all of that. So yes, there is some, but it's nowhere near enough to close a $3.5 to $9 million budget gap, as you might imagine. The best hope for us to have additional revenue coming forward is the HEROES Act, which was introduced this week, and they'll be voting on at the federal level tomorrow or early next week. That is the first and only bill that would provide funding to a city as small as South Pasadena. It's critical that that goes through. And if you hear the governor's comments from today, he says it's critical for the state to receive those dollars as well. Without those dollars, they will be cutting over $54 million out of the state budget. So we are all sort of on the edge of our chair waiting to see what will happen with that bill. And that will be, as I said, tomorrow or early next week, we'll find out the fate of that bill, at least initially.
And let me ask one other thing as well, while I have a moment. Could you give us just a quick overview of the state of the city's reserves? And Stephanie, I guess this is specifically directed at you. Under what circumstance would you recommend to council that the city dip into the reserves? And I'm wondering specifically if you would approve a deficit budget or if you would dip into the reserves.
So we have two kinds of reserves. We have an emergency reserve, which is 25% of our operating budget. And that obviously is reserved for emergencies. It's sort of that rainy day fund. And then we also have reserves for special projects. So we have maybe 10 or 11, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, we have 10 or 11 almost like little savings accounts for specific projects. So there's dollars put aside for the new community center that was envisioned a number of years ago. There's money set aside for a library reconstruction and expansion project that again was envisioned quite a few years ago. There's stormwater reserves. So there's a whole lot of little pots of money like that. Those are also considered reserves. as far as the expenditure of those reserves, I would recommend that we spend off of the special project reserves before we dip into the emergency reserves. The reason for that being, we don't know really how bad things will get next year. We don't know how bad things will get with PERS. We don't know how long it will take for the economy to recover. What I'm most concerned about right now is not when the restrictions will be lifted, but when the market will return. Because I'm seeing survey after survey where Americans are saying, you can lift those regulations all you want. I'm not going back out. I'm not going to a restaurant. I'm not going to a store. You know, people are just afraid. So it could take a long time for consumer behavior to return to the level that we will see the revenues in the city budget that will balance all of this out. So it could be a very long haul where we may need those emergency reserves to keep us going, particularly if we lose the UUT. We may want to use those reserves to stretch our public safety budget while we figure out what an alternative plan might be. So I would recommend that we dip into some of the other pots of money. For example, the community center. I think that project is really on ice right now, considering the long-term future of the city's budget. And so it seems to me that it would be more appropriate to dip into those reserves first and keep the other dollars for the next couple of years. This is also in alignment with the governor's budget this afternoon. He talked about the state reserves, where he's recommending spending them out over a period of 3 years. Because again, he did not anticipate the recovery of state revenue quickly enough to be able to survive the next 3 years without spreading those reserves out over that long period of time.
Thank you.
Okay, next I will call on Commissioner Sawyer.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I just have a question. With this budget situation, can we anticipate that some of the commissions may be disbanded or lose their budgets? Do you think that's a possibility?
I know it's happening in other cities where they've put commissions on hiatus. That's not something that's on the table right now in a big way because none of our commissions have budgets. So in the bigger cities, commissions actually have their own staff and their own dollars that they determine how to spend. None of our commissions have budgets. You're all advisory to the city council. So the cost of having commission meetings is minimal. Although I do have to point out the cost of having commission meetings have gone way up because we're broadcasting and streaming all of our meetings. And there is a cost associated with that technology and with the staff members that have to be in the building at City Hall in order to broadcast and stream all of these meetings. So that's really the only significant cost associated with commissions. The other associated impacts would simply be staff time. So if we do have to end up reducing our staff and we have very few staff to accomplish core functions that are mandated by state law, we may simply not have the staff available to put together an agenda and a packet and minutes and all of those kind of things. So I could see perhaps the workload dropping for commissions, but I don't anticipate that we would eliminate commissions in any way.
Thank you.
All right, next we'll hear from Commissioner Kuramitsu.
Hi. I think I have perhaps a related question, just specific to the Public Art Commission, which is a relatively new commission, and we were sort of anticipating revenues for programming, and I don't know how, I don't know if the pot of money or the potential pot of money, which I think comes from development, would be impacted by this. So it's just a question in general.
To the extent that the dollars would be programming would come from developers and private development projects, that's kind of outside the city budget, so that would not be impacted. Although the economic climate may impact the number of developments we get or whether or not those developments go through. I think it's much too soon to know whether, all those projects are going to come to a halt or not. Certainly any additional funding that we were anticipating in the budget for cultural programming and public arts, I would say that absolutely is going to be on the block, because it's going to be a trade-off between that and police officers on the street or library hours or things like that. And so I think that will be one of those sort of discretionary pots of money that almost certainly will have to be eliminated, unfortunately.
All right, next.
Understood.
Thank you. Next is Vice Chair Hyun.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for all the information. I don't have any questions at this time. I'm kind of processing all this information right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we'll call on Chair Wong.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I don't, same as Fong, I don't have any questions at this time.
Thank you. Next, I will turn to my colleagues on the Cultural Heritage Commission and ask for questions or comments from Commissioner Friedman.
Hello, thank you. I'm sorry if I missed this, but what are some of the larger capital expenses that have been suspended or eliminated to offset the short-term revenue shortfall?
It's primarily street projects. It's street repair and construction, street maintenance. It's primarily those kind of things. There are some facilities maintenance issues, but the largest amount of our dollars in capital goes towards streets.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Morrish.
No questions at this time, thanks.
Thank you. Vice Chair Thompson.
You're still muted, Commissioner.
Go ahead.
You're still muted, Commissioner.
Okay, thanks. This is for Stephanie, I guess. I'm confused about the PERS issues, I guess plural now. I heard a year ago about the forthcoming expenses. I'm not sure how, is that offset, mitigated, is that changed at all? Or is that part of your catastrophic scenario? And what are the new ones? I'm not clear on this. Thanks.
So that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. In short, it's compounding issues with PERS. So yes, we talked about a year ago. The PERS investment fund is underfunded right now. So it's just like any investment fund. They invest in a number of different vehicles. They expect a particular return, and they have to be able to pay out a certain amount every year to all of the retirees. So depending on who you ask, most economists will say that fund should be 85 or 90% funded. So of all the obligations that are due, they should have 85 or 90% of those dollars actually in the investment fund at any one time. After the crash in 2008, the fund dipped down into the 60% area, 63%, I think. It was funded in that range. And they've been struggling to get it back up to a more safely funded level. What they've done over the last number of years, while they're trying to figure out how to repair that fund, is they've changed their return rate or their discount rate. So at one point, I think they had estimated a 7.5% return, which is perhaps reasonable on a private fund, but because it's a state fund, there are a lot of restrictions on the way they can invest the dollars. And so they haven't been able to achieve that. So they've changed the discount rates, and they've also changed the amortization period from 30 years to 20 years. Those changes alone result in much higher rates of payment from the city to pay into the fund. So we were already struggling with those. So we pay an extra $1 million a year, or maybe it's more now. We pay an extra $1 million a year on top of what we're already paying for our employees to help them close that gap. I mean, basically what happens is when PERS doesn't have enough money, where do they go and get the dollars from? Their only option is to either make more money on their investments, which they're trying to do, or they have to come to all of us as their member cities and say, look, we're underfunded. You have to pay us more money every year. And so that's what they've been doing. All cities are already struggling with these increased costs from PERS. Things were looking pretty good. The fund was going to be up around 74% or maybe above that once the governor kicked some dollars in. So things were going really well. Then the pandemic hit, and the fund is lost. I saw one report that they've lost over 30% of the value in the fund over the last 2 months. So it's plummeted back down again. And so again, they're going to have to turn to all of their member cities and say, we're underfunded. You have to give us more dollars to get to a more safely funded level. The challenge with that scenario, and I won't go on this forever because I could talk about it for a long time, is the challenge with that is most cities simply cannot withstand yet another increase in rates or yet another big balloon payment, even if they spread it over 5 years. And I've seen studies that say that the smaller cities will go bankrupt if PERS takes that approach 2 years from now. There's going to have to be some kind of fix between now and when those new rates would hit, because we're not the only city that would struggle with that. But as I pointed out, with the pandemic cuts, with the potential UUT cuts, and then with the potential of an additional $2 million payment a year from PERS, that's the catastrophic combination. If all three of those hit, that's an almost 40% hit to our budget over where we are today. So,
thank you. Has there ever been an explanation as to why they lag so far behind the markets?
There's been a number of different conversations about that. Number one, they'll say is they are so limited on the way they can invest. There's a lot of restrictions on them that are not on private investment funds. Some will say it's also because it's, they're constantly paying out. So even when the market is low, they still have to pay out to all these members all of the time. And then the third thing that maybe is probably the biggest issue is it's structural. They were not built when the system was designed, as with probably any of the pension systems across the country, they were not built to pay benefits to people into their 90s. It's just like Social Security is in the same problem because it was not built assuming that it was going to pay out to people until they were 90. So with people living longer, it's just structurally not able to withstand that. And what's happening now is you used to have a certain ratio of the number of people that were employed and paying into the system was about 2 people for every 1 person or every half person that was actually pulling benefits from the system. Now that's reversed. For every half a person that's paying into the system, there are 2 people drawing benefits out of the system. And that's a function of just the structural balance. It just simply wasn't built to withstand that. And it's the problem that states are having across the country, where it's not unique to California or to the PERS system. So there is much discussion and debate going on how to fix the PERS system, but that's a discussion for another day.
All right, and so last, I will avail myself of the opportunity to make any comments or questions. I really don't have any questions. I just want to say a big thank you to Stephanie and to Karen and to our entire city staff for the really outstanding job that they have done and are doing during these unprecedented times and adapting to the challenges presented. So again, thank you so much for the presentation today and so gracefully taking our questions and comments.
Thank you, Mark. We're so happy to do it. And I do have one ask for all the commissioners before we go. Public engagement on the budget this year is particularly important because we have so many difficult decisions in front of us. So we would like to ask all of you to be ambassadors for us on the budget discussion. And we'd like to ask you if you would please share with your friends and your family the online budget tool that we sent to all of you. If you would please post it on social media, if you're a social media person, and we'll even give you a post that you can just upload so you don't even have to write your own post, or just share it over email if that's the way that you communicate. But we really are striving to get as much public input on the budget this year as we possibly can. And we think we can achieve that because we've built the entire engagement process online this year, which we did because we had to, but it's turning out to be a really interesting twist of fate that this might be the best way to get public engagement. We've heard from many more people already than we have in the past when we did town hall meetings and we passed out paper surveys. So it's a little bit of an interesting experiment this year that we think will go very well, but we need assistance getting the word out, just letting everybody know that the website is there, and then we'd like to hear from them. and that there are survey tools online where they can literally tell us what they think their priorities are. So that is our one ask to you, is if you could broadcast that information out and just talk about it and help people understand how serious it is this year and that we need to hear from them.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. I think Commissioner Burke, do you have a question?
You mentioned an online budget tool, and I'm sorry, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but what online budget tool is that?
Oh, I think we sent it out to all the commissioners, but we can send it again if you didn't get it. Karen, do you want to speak to that?
I'm happy to send it again. It was sent out to all commissioners last week, but we'll send it again. We're sending it after all the commission presentations are finished, which is tonight after 7. We'll send it with that Facebook post or social media post so that everyone can also share it with their respective groups if they would.
Thank you.
And there are 2 survey items on the webpage, just to give you a preview if you haven't seen it. One is one of those traditional budget games where you're given $100, and then we ask people, how would you distribute the $100 among the different departments and programs? And then there's another survey tool that asks about a variety of programs that are likely to be on the block for cuts, and we're asking people to prioritize which of those they would cut first. And then there's also a question that asks people if this is the first time that they've participated in budget outreach. And the numbers so far, I think Karen told me the other day, 80% of the people that are engaging with us online have not engaged in budget conversations before. And so that is fantastic. That's what we're really reaching for. And that's where we need your help to make sure we're reaching all those people that don't normally pay attention to this kind of stuff. I get it. I don't blame them. It probably is really dry and really bureaucratic. But I wouldn't want those people then, 2 months from now to hear that we're having to cut all these things at the city and they're surprised and they're horrified and they wish they had gotten involved earlier. So that's where you can really help us.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. If there's no further questions, the time is now 2:51, and I will declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.